having the vernacular to really say what you mean is so important. What are some tools or maybe even ways that you kind of check yourself or guide others to check themselves when they're trying to really understand what is the feeling going on here?
Naturally, we do go to that step of expressing it, right? What is the word? How do I describe what it is that I'm feeling? And the reality, I think, for most of us is when we are under supported in our emotions, it's often at a time where we don't have language. So for many of us, and again, speaking from my own personal experience, it is really difficult to even to know the label of what it is that I'm feeling. So I think I like to break down change, the process of healing in a way for most of us, into two steps. And the first step as it applies to this conversation is first becoming aware of the sensations in our body, because that's where emotions live. Our energy shifts, it changes. We feel things happening in our physical vessels. So to simplify that step, it would be becoming conscious of our physical body, which is why the new workbook, How to Meet Yourself, begins with that step of reconnecting with our physical self before we even enter into the second section, which is the emotional piece of things. So before we even apply the feeling that might connect to, learning how to just be in our own presence with what is going on in our physical body. And for so many of us, the first step actually then begins with reconnecting with our physical body, especially again, if we were under supported in childhood. We do what a lot of us do. We avoid our physical sensations. We learn how to disconnect or dissociate, like I like to call living on my spaceship. So for me, it was really reconnecting, becoming conscious of my human form before I could then begin to say, okay, this is the language of the feeling that is happening in my physical body.
Such a good point. Yeah. And you have great exercises in there, especially check ins of like this time of day. What are the sensations going on in my body when I wake up before I grab my phone or look at the sun or my meditation, whatever you choose to do first thing? What's the sensations already coming up? And then it's almost like a roadmap to, okay, so does that connect to the beliefs that you're looping behind? Does that connect to the worry that you have about the day? But that first checkpoint being what's happening in my body and regulating that, I think is so powerful.
The reality that some of us might be starting with the behavior, with what we're doing. We're exploding, we're screaming, we're yelling. You might find yourself like me. I'm disconnected. I've avoided the situation. I've fled. I've left the room. I've shut the person down or whatever it is. So I do want to speak to the reality that for so many of us, that's our starting point. We catch ourselves maybe in the action of reacting or oftentimes after the fact, oftentimes feeling very shameful after the fact of what we've done. But that could be our starting point, because understanding that those explosive, whether we're exploding outward or we're turning inward with those emotions, the behavior, the reaction that you very beautifully brought up is connected to how we were feeling, to that deeper discomfort. So for so many of us, it means, starting there, kind of seeing after the fact and witnessing those patterns without judging them, understanding that they are, coming from an attempt at safety. Again, when we were in that pre-verbal stage, when we didn't have the attuned caregiver to hold space, to be curious, to help us make sense and give us language about what we were feeling, and then find an appropriate, connected way to deal with it, we learned, we adapted. And so many of us into our adulthood carry on those habitual coping mechanisms. And again, we shame ourselves because they do cause ourselves harm. They cause our loved ones harm. But if we can, again, expand in compassion, which is why I'm always talking about the physiology, the nervous system, kind of where these things are originating from, then I think we can give ourselves the opportunity to even just start there. Okay, I am someone who explodes. I don't know exactly what's happening in my body, but I can have some language now for the reality that I didn't feel safe in what is happening in my body. So I felt like I had to project it outward, or I had to turn it inward, or I had to avoid it. And then we can almost start building the pieces backward in that way.
Are there any other tools or tips that you would suggest for someone like when they're in that elevated state, whether they're disassociating or whether they're projecting out anger, or maybe they're even just like so upset with someone, resentment's bubbling up or anger internally and they're turning it inward, which is another thing that happens to people too?
We don't have access to that moment of different awareness. And that's why so many of us rely on the old ways that that we've once
Mhm.
dealt with it. When our prefrontal cortex isn't online, we can't see a new solution. That beautiful solution that you might have even talked about with that therapist last Tuesday, right, in session, you don't actually have access to that in real time, which is why we return to those past solutions, screaming, yelling, dissociating, leaving, or whatever it is. And I think that another helpful suggestion, and this is, I think, often counterintuitive and maybe not what we like to hear, begins outside of those moments, begins with caring for our nervous system, with understanding that we do have a nervous system and that ability to maintain connection to the pause, to the prefrontal cortex, to all of the new different solutions that you want to embody to make that change happens when our nervous system is in a calm state of grounded, peaceful regulation. And I'll be the first to admit, I spent decades of my life the farthest from that grounded, peaceful state. So for a lot of us, it's the more preventative, I think is the language listeners might have heard, care of our bodies, making sure that we're getting and giving it the nutrients that we have access to that it needs, making sure sleep is incredibly important, that it's getting prioritized just as much as sleep, restful moments throughout our day. I mean, we live in a culture now where we're being validated and affirmed by endlessly doing all of the time. Our nervous system needs those moments to be in peace, to be in calm. Our body also needs to, at some points, move to discharge its energy. So by building in a commitment to shifts, small daily promises to create new habits, because of course I even just, voiced 3 different things we could start doing differently. We have to understand that, especially when it comes to our body, especially when it comes to our nervous system, a lot of us, for very understandable reasons, want to reshape our life, want to start eating differently, start sleeping differently, start moving differently. And because our subconscious mind, or will always register the possibility of threat, I should say, in the unfamiliar, the more expectation we put on ourselves to revamp our life overnight, the more likely we're going to feel that resistance, to feel uncomfortable, and to return back to those old habits. So by caring for our body might mean by making a daily commitment and getting really consistent with maybe eating in a different way, sleeping in a different way, allowing rest in a different way. And then over time, the more we're caring for our nervous system, the more then we have access in those moments of reactivity to return to that peaceful balance that now we've been practicing outside of those moments.
That is such a good point, and I feel like you really gave sort of the science context behind why just brute force in your goals is not actually the most effective path if you're looking for lasting change. Because quite literally, at the base level, your nervous system is not feeling safe in these new behaviors. And so taking it slow and steady and incremental is allowing space for your nervous system to catch up to the new behavior, to really instill the new habit and for it to feel like second nature.